Welcome to Banyen Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyen.com. Since 1970, Banyen Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyen.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy.
Hello and welcome. My name is Jacob Steele, the events manager for Banyen Books and Sound. This evening, we are delighted to host Radhule Weininger in conversation with Michael Kearney for a discussion of Radhule's new book, Heart Medicine: How to Stop Painful Patterns and Find Peace and Freedom at Last. Before introducing our honored guests, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that although we have participants joining us from all around the world this evening, the physical location of Banyen Books is on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Now for the introductions. Radhule Weininger, PhD, MD, is a clinical psychologist, founder of the nonprofit Mindful Heart programs, and teacher of deep mindfulness and compassion practices in Buddhist psychology. She began her meditation studies in 1980 at Black Rock Monastery in Sri Lanka. For the past 20 years, she is mentored in her teaching by Jack Kornfield and by JOANNA MACY in her interest in engaged Buddhism. She is the author of Heartwork, The Path of Self-Compassion, and Heart Medicine: How to Stop Painful Patterns and Find Freedom and Peace at Last. You'll find lots of free online classes that she leads at mindfulheartprograms.org. Michael Kearney, MD, is a physician specializing in hospice and palliative medicine with over 35 years experience. He lived in Ireland, England, France, and Canada before moving to the United States in 2001. He currently lives in Santa Barbara, California, where he is a founding partner of Palliative Care Consultants of Santa Barbara. He's the author of several books, including Mortally Wounded and Nest in the Stream. Radhule Weininger and Michael Kearney are the founding teachers of Mindful Heart programs. Tonight's featured book, Heart Medicine, has forewords from His Holiness the Dalai Lama and JOANNA MACY. Buddhist teacher Tara Brach has described the book as a beautiful invitation to discover and heal the persistent patterns that create suffering in our lives. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has written, "By reducing our tendency towards disturbing mental states, we experience greater peace of mind. And I hope that Radhule Weininger's book will inspire readers to build their confidence to lead a more meaningful life." On behalf of Banyen Books, it's an honor to welcome you both. I now turn it over to you, Radhule and Michael, to commence the conversation.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you very much. And good evening, everybody. And thank you for joining us. So Radhule, I guess one piece in the introduction, and Jacob's kind introduction, just one piece to add to the introduction, and that is that Radhule and I are also husband and wife, which happens to be why we're here this evening on the couch with our dog Lucy, who you see here. So, Radhule, just to begin the conversation, your first book was called Heartwork: The Path of Self-Compassion, 9 Practices for Opening the Heart. And your second book, as we've just heard, your current book is Heart Medicine: How to Stop Painful Patterns and Find Peace and Freedom at Last. Could we begin the conversation by you just telling us why you wanted to write the second book, why you wanted to write this book?
All right. My first book, working on self-compassion, seemed really important for me. Often my books come out of my own personal work, to make friends with myself and to find a way to do that. And I found, however, that there were these long-standing painful patterns in my life that were repeating themselves and coming over and over again. And then in conversation with my mentor, Jack Cornfield, who always encouraged me to work on this and to write about this, I started to think, how can we find a way between the Western psychological and the spiritual, the Buddhist psychological, to find a way forward through these really difficult conditions that we need to work with. And I was just seeing in myself and my clients and students how these patterns are so tenacious and repetitive and come again and again, as if we were sitting ducks to these lurps, as I call them, long-standing, recurrent, painful patterns, that I decided to write a book about it.
Thank you. Maybe for, to say a little more about what you mean by, when you talk about a long-standing, recurrent, painful pattern, and you sometimes in your book you call it a LRP, LRPP. So it has a sort of an onomatopoeic ring about it. Can you say a little bit more about what a LRP is, and maybe give us an example of a LRP?
So I think these lurps had different names before. Freud and Jung called them complexes, knots of emotions, body sensations, memories, sometimes events that happen again and again, sometimes just with different actors in different situations, but they have the same feeling tone to them. And so I think long since, at least in Western psychology, people tried to work with them. And then on the Eastern side, they have been described as samskaras, or in Pali, shankaras. And there they are actually seen as going through life streams, through lifetimes, and are repeating themselves. And I felt that there wasn't really a very good way of working with them. We can understand them, or we can hope they might wash themselves out or go away. But I just thought it would be so helpful if we found more of a way of working with them. As an example, I know lurps from my own history. I was, the first 2 years of my life, my mom hid me in a children's home, in an orphanage, because she wasn't married. And then my relatives, after she kind of brought me home, were not always nice. So I know from myself a pattern of rejection, of maybe abandonment, and so which I worked through years of therapy on. But just I saw this kind of patterning repeating themselves, feeling easily rejected, feeling easily abandoned, and sometimes also experiencing that again and again. And it made me curious, because I really put in a very big effort to work on this through years of therapy and many decades of meditation. And so I got really interested, how can I help others with a similar predicament to work through this? And I realized in myself that they got lighter, that they weren't in the front seat anymore, that they turned to the back seat, that they weren't so disruptive anymore to my relationship to life and my relationships to people. And so that's why I got very interested in them.
Okay, thank you. You in the first part of your book, the final chapter in the first part of your book is freedom is possible. So you described a little bit LRPs, what they are, long-standing recurrent painful patterns, and how they repeat or can repeat over time, maybe in different circumstances, but with a similar feeling tone. So you can recognize them. Oh, here comes that LRP again, sort of thing. But when you talk about freedom is possible, could you say a little more? You know, that's the of the Buddha's Four Noble Truths. Freedom is possible is the third noble truth. Freedom from suffering is possible. So what does freedom from a long-standing recurrent pattern look like? When we talk about healing a LRP, or we talk about freedom, what can we expect?
Well, I think there's a whole continuum of, how would I say, freedom that is possible. I think it's definitely a long-standing piece of work. I felt I needed a few years of therapy and of meditation practice to start feeling a loosening of the grab, a loosening of the hold on me. And so I think we can definitely expect, if we diligently work on it, a loosening, some freedom. I think it's not that they totally disappear. You know, it's not like taking an aspirin or even just taking an MBSR course. There's more work involved in this. But I think we can expect that they won't be anymore in the front seat of the car grabbing the steering wheel. They will be first maybe in the passenger seat and then in the back seat and hopefully at some point in the trailer. And so I think the main thing is that when things happen now, I recognize it, but it doesn't have that same hold on me, that same grab.
So that recognition is an important step in the process of finding freedom. And that's the whole second part of your book is 12 steps towards healing. So could you say a little more about that process of recognition and what can help in that process of recognition?
So, like in all Buddhist practices and in psychotherapy, awareness is really important. Awareness about ourselves, having a methodology to look inward, to be aware of our relationships, being present. So in a way, awareness is the first medicine. But then with this awareness, it's important to notice when we got, as I might call it, lurped, you know, and that often feels like maybe a physical sensation, like a tightness in the chest, a feeling as if somebody knocked us in the stomach. We might feel hot or cold or a bit dizzy or a bit of tunnel vision, or we might feel suddenly very angry, maybe more than the situation would be appropriate to. So an extraordinary amount of physical sensation and of emotion and of reactivity is usually something where I see, wow, I must have gotten lurped.
So that awareness of that, and I guess the earlier we can recognize that something has triggered the lurp, the better. Can you say, you're a Western trained psychologist, and you're also a Buddhist meditator for many, many years. And you really bring those two psychologies together, Western psychology and Buddhist psychology. You bring them both together in your book. can you say, can talk a little bit about what's helpful about Western psychology in approaching a LRP, and what's helpful about Buddhist psychology in approaching a LRP?
Well, Buddhist meditation is very, at least Theravadan Buddhist meditation, it might not be true for all the Tibetan styles of meditation, is very process oriented. We don't really go into the content of what happened. So we notice and we see the impermanence of it, and we allow it to pass through, like a leaf on a river going downstreams. While Western psychology, and there are so many different kinds, but it's a bit more interested in content, in understanding what really went on in your childhood, what really has been going on, and to understand that with compassion and tenderness and real interest, helping to understand. And often understanding leads to compassion. And I find, especially for us in Westerners, or maybe I should rather say modernity, because I think it's people in Bombay and Jakarta and New York alike, we need this listening to the story at least maybe once, and the feeling deeply together with a trusted person. And then Buddhist psychology really helps, because it encourages us not to let this go into rumination, because the story could easily become something we repeat and repeat. I think in Pali they call that papancha. It's a great word, papancha. So with Buddhist meditation, we learn to notice and let pass through, and that is really helpful. There is this emphasis on impermanence and change.
Mm-hmm. So, and you mentioned rumination, yeah, and I remember you talk quite a bit about rumination as being one of the almost kind of diagnostic characteristic features of a long-standing recurrent painful pattern, that it can become like a vortex, an energetic vortex internally that kind of pulls all our thinking into its orbit. And rumination can be very much part of that. And are you saying that that Buddhist psychology is particularly helpful in this process?
Yeah, it is. Because rumination is one of the responses to trauma, that we circle again and again and again around the wound when we got traumatized. And in some ways, then we need both. We need insight, mindful noticing, as well as compassion, to allow this to pass through, and to even notice that we are ruminating, and to bring it back to the felt sense of our body. And then we are in the present moment, where the leaf can go down the river.
Now you mentioned, I think you have one of the chapters in the book is one of the early chapters, at the heart of a long-standing recurrent painful pattern is trauma. Mm-hmm. So do you think LRPs are perhaps an unrecognized, or not given enough credit as one of the outcomes of trauma? I mean, we hear about, some of the classic kind of signs of PTSD, for example, like avoidance but do you think long-standing recurrent painful patterns are a feature of, are an unrecognized feature of a lot of trauma?
Yeah, definitely, or recognized. It's just not called that. But definitely a trauma leaves a wound, you know, and it's like as if a callus forms around it, you know, around this wound, to protect this wound, to defend this wound, and that leads then to the repetition, the compulsion to repeat.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So it sounds like kind of one of the early steps is recognition.
Yeah.
And it sounds like both self-awareness that can come from, you know, Western psychology, and telling the story in a reflective way can be helpful in that, but also the mindfulness that comes from meditation practice can be helpful in that. And then the mindfulness can also help us recognize when something has triggered one of these old patterns. What then? What's the next step in the process?
The next step in the process is, after we recognize, oh, we have been lurped, is to use our mindfulness skills, you know, to notice, oh yeah, tightness of the chest, and allow this to be there, to be with it, and to notice when it passes by. Or a compulsion to eat a pot of ice cream, or get a bottle of whiskey, or whatever we feel drawn to do, to notice that, and then to allow ourselves to not follow that urge. But what's also important is self-compassion, you know, having a sense of empathy for ourselves. And I find that noticing that I have gotten lurped gives me the sense of compassion. Yeah, you know, because often we blame ourselves for being lurped. Why do I take this so serious? Why can't I just let go of that? Why do I even react? Why do I overreact? And often we get this criticism from ourselves and from others. You know, why do you take this so hard? Why are you so reactive? And then noticing that we have gotten lurped, and then holding that with empathy and compassion allows us to calm down, you know, allows in a way the grab to kind of loosen up. And then other steps are what I call the mindful pause, you know, to maybe even have a little practice during the day that allows me very quickly to work with what happened. Let's say I might feel offended, or somebody might feel offended in a meeting, in a board meeting, or meeting with colleagues, maybe put down or talked over, or whatever might have happened to us. And then we can always, not always, but often excuse ourselves. We have to go to the restroom, or get a glass of water, or, you know, go to the parking meter, or find an excuse to just step out for a moment, to take a time out. And then to take maybe just 2 minutes to notice what it feels like in the body, to exhale, to relax, to notice that we have been hurt, to feel the breath going through our heart, to offer compassion towards ourselves, to connect back to breath, and then to notice when we feel ready to re-engage. And such a little mindful pause, as I call them, can be really helpful in situations during the day when we can't go off for a weekend retreat or an hour in the morning. Then we might just have 5 minutes.
And it would seem that the process of mindfulness and mindful awareness of what's happening is really key to that. And I notice you talk in both your books about the importance of sort of cultivating the background field. So the difference between an emotional background field or a psychological background field where you're stressed and you're tired and you're hungry, and if you get triggered against that backdrop or in that kind of context, it's much more likely to lead to the kind of reactive acting out. Whereas if the background field, the energetic background field, psychological, is one of more mindfulness, and one gets triggered, one is more likely to recognize that one has been triggered earlier in the process. How do you cultivate the right kind of background field, if you like?
Well, I think daily meditation is really helpful. And if we have the luxury to now and then go on a retreat, is wonderful. Spending time in nature really helps to clear out, let's say, the dust on our eyes or the stuffiness that is there. And I wanted to say to that regards that nowadays often the background field, at least here in the States, is quite inflamed culturally, socially, politically, because of COVID, because of climate change. So I think it's hard. We have to do extra self-care to clear this background field, or at least have it a little bit lighted up so that we don't get so triggered. So I think all of us need a little bit more self-care in these times.
Okay. And the importance of practice and regular practice.
Yeah, and psychotherapy can also be helpful. And being around people that also have kind of a calm feel around them is helpful. And that's not always possible. Let's say we have little children or difficult family. Sometimes it's not so easy to come to that place. But, every bit of practice helps. And I was just remembering this wonderful book by Sharon Salzberg, Faith, where she says, if we put one step in front of the next, we can have the faith that doors will open. So the faith in the practice. So if we keep practicing, even little by little, doors will eventually open.
Yeah, thank you. That's nice. And you mentioned when you were talking about the mini mindful pause practice that you can do in the middle of the day if you notice you've been triggered or a LRP has been triggered. And you one of the steps in that you mentioned was kind of just dropping into your body and being aware of how your body is holding your experience at that moment. And I noticed one of your chapters in the book is, in fact, there's two chapters in the 12-step part of the book where you talk about learning to stay with suffering and breathing through to let be and let go. So that would seem to be, going into this a little bit more deeply. But could you talk a little bit about that and why it's important?
Yes, I think it's when we have time to do this. I remember a retreat when I felt really triggered, and I couldn't leave.
Could you say a little more about the story, the circumstances, just to
some
give us a feeling?
People who had really kind of rejected me before, and actually a local spiritual group, suddenly were at this 4-week retreat. So here I was stewing in my own stew, basically, having to work with this. And so I said, okay, I'm taking this challenge and I work with this. And I really did, with self-compassion, with learning to be with the feelings, with being with the felt sense. And I learned there a lot from Pema Children. And there's this wonderful audiobook by her, When Pain is the Doorway. So where she teaches us to not run away, to be with the felt sense of what we are experiencing. And then sooner or later, as everything is changed, change will occur, and actually an opening. And so both of those practices, staying with our suffering and breathing through, which I actually learned from you as a
And I learned from JOANNA MACY.
You learned from JOANNA MACY. We both learned from JOANNA MACY. Is a wonderful practices, because sometimes it's important that we lean into our pain to get through it, to emerge on the other side.
Yeah, thank you. So as we do that, how can what are little telltale signs or markers that perhaps the long-standing, recurrent, painful pattern which we now have recognized, oh my goodness, it's turned up again and again and again through my life, coming back maybe dressed in slightly different clothes, but the same pattern. How can I tell that with the sort of practices you're describing here, how can I tell that it's loosening its grip a little bit, that I'm not quite so much in its power as I was before?
I would say that will be very clearly recognizable, because you feel when you got lurped. You know, one of my Jungian analyst friends calls it is as if you put a finger into an electric outlet. Not every lurp is as drastic, but it can be quite strong, this feeling of getting triggered in an old recurrent wound. And so I find this, you know, it's like my own lurp around abandonment or rejection. I just notice it's much easier now. You know, it's like there is just not the same grab, the same hold on my heart. You know, it's more like, okay, this is happening, and it's not leaving a big physical reaction in me.
Okay.
And I see that in my clients and my students. What a relief that is.
Okay, thank you. So that kind of brings me back to the first part of the book, where you talk about awareness when entangled in lurps with others. So it's one thing to have my long-standing, recurrent, painful pattern triggered by some event or events. But then if I'm in relationship with somebody and the circumstances have somehow triggered lurps in me and in the other, and we're in relationship and we've got lurp meeting lurp. Can you say a little bit about that, about what can we do? And it's hard enough to deal with our own lurps, but
Yeah. Well, it's actually quite common, and I think it's beautifully described by Eckhart Tolle as pain body. And when our pain body rubs another pain body, then there is something's happening. And I think in my book, Heart Medicine, I bring up the story of Sarah and Judith, who worked together and really triggered each other and in each other's wounds. And the more one was like herself, she triggered the other, and vice versa. And I think because both of them were meditators and had some interest in awareness, they kind of were able to recognize this. But even they had to take several times out from each other to kind of cool off and give some space. So I think that quite often happens when we feel really inflamed and triggered. Then often we meet a complementary triggered person, and that rubs against each other. Mine very difficult is that when it's in couples, which I think I have one mindful pause for pairs and couples, which I think is in the first book, the Hard Work, the Path of Self-Compassion, where I talk about that. And, then we say, we can be each other's nemesis, but also each other's greatest teachers.
Can you point out to somebody else that they've been lurped? Does that help?
Well, I would say with my clients, I'm a psychologist, psychotherapist in my daytime work. I think there has to be first some trust developed. I can't just in the first session say, and you got lurped. That's would feel like how do we call this in psychology, a narcissistic wounding or an empathic failure to do that. So I think one has to be very careful and skillful about this. But actually for some of my clients, after some time, they really like the word and they use it themselves and they say, oh, I got lurped again. And it's actually then becoming a relief for them to give it, a diagnosis, and then maybe what do we do about this? So it's not so free-floating anxiety and so mysterious and maybe even hopeless anymore. So I think it's important to not use that word as a weapon between
and probably
couples.
Between couples, I could think maybe.
Or parents and children. No, don't do that with your child, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So really not diagnosing lurps in someone else. That,
Right.
recognizing it in oneself is something one can do.
Yeah, it feels very vulnerable.
Thank you. So, towards the final part of your book, you talk about, you have a chapter called Letting in the Mystery.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about what you mean?
So in the last, maybe it's since the 2003-05 when I got to know Alan Wallace, and the last 4 years or so studying with Dan Brown, I got a little bit acquainted with Mahamudra Dzogchen practices. I have been really, besides my Theravadan practice, got really curious about this. And there is this understanding that awareness goes beyond the moment by moment, non-judgmental attention, but that awareness is also something that's a priori there, that's already there. It has the quality of a field, even though it's not a thing. It's something that is there and that we can rest into and tap into. And it has a sense of spaciousness and wisdom. And I think we, even from the Theravadan practice, we know that often in the end of long-term retreats, 10 days or 4 weeks, awareness breaks through and we feel it. However, it kind of wears off after a few weeks often. And so I felt it very relieving and helpful from my Tibetan trained teachers to learn some practices, they're called the pointing out practices, on how to get to this place of resting and awareness quicker, so that I can actually have this experience in my morning meditation. And then from that place, I'm actually able to be more mindful, to be more sharp. It's like a flow state. And to have a bit more spaciousness around my experience, but to bring it back to being aware and mindful.
And you've come to this after 40 years of practice, of Buddhist practice. Do you think this is something that is accessible to somebody who's just starting out on the road of meditation, or is this really an advanced practice? I mean, because you do mention it as in your book, the the medicine of awareness.
Yeah.
You talk about.
No, I don't think it has to be as advanced as we might think. For example, studying with Dan Brown, they're very advanced meditators, and there are people who are fairly new at it. It's not as difficult as we think. However, these are practices that have been kept very secret for many good reasons. But I think in this time, which is a very lurpy time in our culture and our world, where we all get, have, well, no, maybe not everybody, but many of us have mounting challenges to deal with and anxieties. I think these are incredibly valuable practices to learn, not as an escape, but as a refuge with which we then can be present. Because I know you are telling me sometimes you're doing these practices on your way to the hospital, which then allows you to be available in a much more spacious way with a very difficult situation with a dying person. And so I think these are practices that are more accessible than we think. But I think it's important to connect them with compassion and engagement.
Thank you. Yeah, because in your conclusion, I mean, continuing in the same vein, as we're talking, you say many steps, reflecting on all the different steps you've discussed, many steps are critical, but the most challenging step with a LRP is loosening our identification with the drama in which we're entangled, and opening to a wider, more spacious perspective. Ultimately, I had to ground my practice of mindfulness and compassion in deeper soil, the great mystery, the field of awareness, which has the qualities of stillness, presence, aliveness, love, and luminous knowing. Rooting the practice in the great mystery finally frees us from our lurps. Do you want to say anything in response to?
Yeah, I think a loosening identification is a really difficult task. And I remember being sometimes a bit annoyed in retreats when teachers just say, oh, just let go of identification. And it's just so hard. It's such a difficult piece of work. And I think there are different ways to get to it. I describe in that chapter, for example, dream work, working with dream images can be a way, embodied imagination can be a way to do that. Or, there are different ways to create more space. But resting in this wider perspective, in the numinous, as Jung called it, in the sacred, in the wider perspective of awake awareness, I think that really allows us, as we practice that way, for the LRP to lose its hold on us, its grab.
Thank you. My final sort of question relates to some comments of the Dalai Lama in his foreword, and then a few lines for use, I think, speak to this at the very end of your book. But the Dalai Lama writes, "I've come to recognize that nurturing concern for others gives me a sense of satisfaction and joy. It's natural to care for oneself. However, being compassionate towards others is a more effective way of caring for oneself." And you say, I think it's the very last line in your book, you're talking about the Dalai Lama, you're talking about how, when you were able to travel to India, you would go each year to his teachings in Dharamsala to hear him teaching. You talk about how each year he, in maybe using a different text, but he comes back to the same message again and again and again, which is about interdependence and our radical interdependence. And you write, now I understand that interdependence is the message for healing the lurps of the world. And putting those two together, your very final step is service. Sharing our healing sets us free. Do you just want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think the Dalai Lama is so right on in so many things, but especially in this, in that he says compassion is wise, selfish. Interesting way of putting it, that being compassionate and helpful and in service of others helps us too, because it frees us from what Tara Brach called the delusion of separateness. And that is kind of on a personal level and on a collective level, our big wound. It's this delusion of separateness, that we feel so separate from others, that there's so much an I versus you and us versus them and higher and lower and our differences and excluding each other's, which we now see, for example, with COVID vaccines. Do we vaccinate everybody? But if we don't, it really costs the whole world, because we are all interdependent. And so on a personal and on a collective level, we have to remember our interdependence and know that taking care of each other is ultimately what sets us free, because it is practicing that what we really are, which is interdependent. We are in truth interdependent and not separate. And with service, with including everybody, we actually live that truth.
And service comes as the 12th step, but is it something that needs to come at the very end, when we've sort of worked through as far as we can work things through in terms of our own personal healing, that then we're ready to offer service and compassion to others? Or is it something that can come sooner and be part of the healing process? And is there a relationship between our wounding and our LRP and the type of service that we can offer others?
I think all those steps are interchangeable. You don't have to do them. Just open the book somewhere and see what comes up. So service could come much earlier. And some people start with service. I remember myself, as a teenager working in the hospital and actually working in a nursing home on the floor where people were dying. And I would say that saved me. And so I think this can come at any point. But you had the second half of the sentence. What was it?
Whether our particular LRP informs the type of service that we can offer.
And I know our time is almost out, but there is this concept which comes from Jungian philosophy, the wounded healer. And often our particular wound has something to do with the service we give to others. Not always, all service is wonderful, but sometimes we are expert on a different type of wound, and especially helpful in that way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Jacob, we come back to you.
Hi. So we have some questions from the audience coming in. And so there's a question from Silva. She asked, do you think it is possible to heal trauma due to sexual abuse that happened in early childhood?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, I think the effects of the trauma can definitely lessen. I did my dissertation about incest survivor groups and worked a lot with that. And I think it's definitely needing a lot of care and loving attention and a good therapist. And but I think with meditation practice and psychotherapy together, I think we can definitely reach a significant measure of freedom.
There's a question from Lily. I find that there are shared lurps in my family, which often become ruminating in conversations. What do you think is the best way to handle getting sucked into the lurp?
Well, let's say at a Christmas dinner, I can relate to that. I came from a refugee family, and often there was this victim mentality that was just bounced around over the table endlessly. So I think, tact is definitely important, but sometimes we can, without being hurtful or provocative, change the situation, the theme a little bit, or maybe just make a gentle comment like, wow, it seems we all are really still affected by so and so. Sometimes just making a comment, a statement about what is happening allows one to move on.
Would that also, if I might just throw in, I mean, would that also be a situation where a mindful pause might be helpful? I mean, if one feels oneself getting sucked in.
Yeah, that definitely. It's like you can't ask everybody to do a mindful pause. I don't think that would go over well.
No, not everybody.
Maybe in a
yourself,
very
I'm thinking
enlightened,
yourself.
but yourself would definitely be a good thing to do.
There's a question from Gert. She writes, thank you, Radhule, for your wide perspective and many ideas to help ourselves and others. Do you have a suggestion for introducing your idea of cultivating self-compassion to children?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, as a Mindful Heart program, we started a school program, which now became so big that it was taken over by a big Santa Barbara nonprofit. And we called it Mindfulness and Heartfulness. And we started with 5-year-olds. And I think the heartfulness was very popular and kids got it very easily.
And the program is called Kind Mind.
Kind Mind, Santa Barbara, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, that makes me wonder, have you worked at all with the Dalai Lama Center for Peace and Education?
No, I wish I would, but I usually we both go to India, and before that I took when my kids were teenagers, I took them to India and to Dharamsala, and we would see the Dalai Lama, but I haven't here. I probably should. I know a gentleman in Vancouver. I think you're in Vancouver. He wrote a few books with the Dalai Lama.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember his name. We've hosted him for events. I'm forgetting.
Yeah, what was his name? We met him in India and
Victor Chan?
Victor Chan, right. So best wishes to Victor Chan and his wife, and we met in Ladakh at the Kumbh Mela or the Kalachakra.
Yeah, your work seems to resonate well with a lot of the work they do. There's a question from Kristen. She writes, hello, I just got your book yesterday, so I've only read the introduction so far. I'm looking forward to reading more. I believe in the intro, you talk about working together as we heal. Is there a chapter or practice in particular that would help with having boundaries, but still being giving and compassionate with others?
I think I mentioned that when I talk about compassion for others and the world. And so I think boundaries are mentioned. And I think, again, the Dalai Lama talks about it when he talks about wise compassionate and stupid compassionate. So I think it's important that wisdom and compassion are balanced. So I think what is the saying that the bird has two wings to fly, wisdom and compassion. And if we only were on the side of compassion, it can be a little murky. And when we only were on the side of wisdom, there can be a little bit of rigidity. So we need both.
And how, if I could just add a kind of a question to that, how does mindfulness protect us? How does mindfulness create? Does it create a boundary? What's the relationship between mindfulness and a boundary?
Oh, good question. Yes, I think there is more awareness. Awareness about ourselves, about the other. There's metacognitive awareness, noticing our own process, our own inner process, and being finely tuned to the other. Mm-hmm. So I think mindfulness is a wonderful prerequisite to really good boundaries.
Can help us to self-monitor in a situation. So
yeah.
So that raises a question for me. I haven't found, like, through mindfulness practices, meditation practices, that it gives me better discernment and better boundaries, like things like you're describing. But sometimes also I find that it sort of like peels away some of the sort of defenses or like buffers that so things can kind of almost hurt more, like the world can feel very sensitive.
That's true. I remember that especially after long retreats, coming out to the first gas station and feeling kind of almost raw and to the energies of everybody around. So that is true too. But I think that's especially something to watch out when you come out of a long retreat. But if you do hours of daily meditation, that would be the case. But if you do, let's say, an hour a day or 45 minutes or half hour a day, I think it would be more protective than a problem.
Excellent, thank you. So we've come to the end of the hour. Is there any kind of last things you want to share?
Well, just that I'm really curious about people's comments and ideas. I think on our website or my website, there's my email, radhule@gmail.com. I think this book is meant to be the beginning of a conversation. In some ways, I think I haven't really seen others write exactly that kind of book. It's in a way a bit of a new bridge to make. And so I hope there will be a lot of other pieces of work, like articles, courses, books that take that a little further. So I would really invite a conversation with whoever would like to have it with me or us. And also, you're really welcome to join our meditations. I teach especially the awareness meditations Monday nights and in the early morning at 7:30 to 8 Pacific time. And Sunday mornings we both teach together. Sunday mornings quite a few people from Europe join us, and Monday and Wednesday nights, people from Asia. So it's always lovely to see new faces and new questions and comments. So everybody's invited and it's free.
And that's at mindfulheartprograms.org.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for this profound conversation. And I know that the word LRP is now going to be part of my vocabulary.
For better or for worse.
For better or for worse, I can't unhear it. And just a reminder to everybody, you can purchase heart medicine from Banyen Books at banyen.com, BANYEN.com. And you can find out more about Radhule's work at mindfulheartprograms.org or radhuleweiningerphd.com. And you can also find out about Michael Kearney's work at michaelkearneymd.com. So just thanks again. It's been a real deep honor to have you guys with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Jacob.
Thanks for being such a gracious host. Really wonderful.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyen Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. The show is edited by Abdo Habani. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyen Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyen.com.